Hey guys, King's Indian attack is a very interesting opening. More than just an opening, it's a system that you can play against some different defenses black can try. It involves a development setup for the opening and some typical plans and ideas for the middle game. In general, there's no need of a deep knowledge in opening theory. It's easy to play. The move orders don't affect too much, which means that it's very flexible, and at the same time it's very versatile since you can play it against French, Sicilian, Caracan, and other defenses. So we will have King's Indian attack on the board when we develop pieces like this: pawn to e4, pawn to d3, pawn to e3, and the pieces a knight to d2, the other knight to f3, and the bishop to g2, and of course we will castle kingside. I didn't say this in order, I just said pawns first and pieces afterwards, but well, that's the idea, that's the scheme or system we use when we want to play King's Indian attack. So let's see it on the board with moves. So for example, let's assume black plays a French defense. Here we can play second move d3, and after d5 then we want to play knight d2. And we were saying that the order of the moves is not essential in King's Indian attack, and that's true, but we need to highlight something. There's an exception here, because at this point when your opponent plays d5, they will be threatening d takes e4 and trading queens, and also our king won't be able to castle in the rest of the game. So at this point, usually when black plays d5, in general we will need to play the move knight d2, and then we will continue with any order. And as I was saying, it's not essential the rest of the development, but knight d2 is, we should say, is an important move at this point. Black plays, for example, c5, and we can continue knight f3, and let's say knight c6, we can play g3. After knight f6, we play bishop g2, and after bishop, let's say e7, we can castle. And this is the setup we were trying to get. Now we are playing a King's Indian attack here. This time we are playing it against the French, but also I want to highlight that, for example, against Sicilian, we can do more or less the same thing, like knight f3, and well, if they play something like e6, well, we can play d3, and then, well, our normal development, like g3, d5, we shouldn't play bishop g2 here, we need to play knight d2, avoiding the trade of queens on d1, and well, you know, the normal development for the rest of the moves is also working against a Sicilian, and also against the Caracan we can do the same idea of d3, knight d2, but basically against any line black can play we can do this setup of King's Indian attack. Also we can start with a different first move, not necessarily with e4. We can play knight f3 first move, or g3 first move, or d3 in the first move, depending on what you're trying to get, depending on your opponent and how he develops pieces. It could be more convenient at some point to change the order. So I'm gonna show you a main line so we can get into the middle game. So let's say black plays French and then d5, we play knight d2. Probably c5 is a normal move here, we play knight f3. After knight c6, we can continue with our development of the bishop over the fianchetto. Knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, we castle. And when black castles, this is the key. At this point, we're gonna play rook e1. And the idea is that we want to play e5, and we want to keep a very good protection of that pawn in the center, but also rook e1 is clear in f1, so we can do some maneuvers with the knight over f1, and the bishop can also be developed once we do that. The game can continue with b5, for example. We can play e5 at this point, and then knight goes to f1. After a5, well, this is a good moment to start advancing the h pawn. We're gonna talk a lot about this advance. So h4, b4, and then bishop a4. This is a main line in King's Indian attack. Observe every piece is making sense at this point. The bishop and the knight are guarding the central pawn. The knight is on f1, and we will see many interesting plans with the knight there. Also the rook is helping a lot from e1. And the main idea is that we want to start an attack against the castle king. Observe we have more space in the center, but also on the king side, so we're gonna try to take advantage of that space by attacking very strongly on that side of the board. What is going to happen in the middle game? Well, there are many interesting plans we need to highlight for King's Indian attack. In the middle game, we want to improve this knight, and the most common path is going to be knight h2, knight g4, but also in some positions we can use knight e3, knight g4. And I have seen in some specific game the idea of g4 and then knight g3. Of course, the pawn is hanging not exactly here, but in some positions it's going to work this plan, so the knight is more active, and also we can use the pawns to continue with the attack. Usually the queen can go over g4 or h5, and I want to highlight this bishop here. There is a very common maneuver with the bishop that can be decisive in some specific positions, and it is the maneuver when we bring the bishop to this diagonal. Very often we can see the plan bishop f1, bishop d3. Of course the pawn cannot be there to be able to do that, but also in some other positions the bishop can join this diagonal over e4 and can create many problems on the king side from that square. Besides, there is this extremely common plan of using the h pawn as a spearhead, trying to break on h6. Whenever we do this, our opponent will have two main ways to deal with that plan. Usually they can either play h6 to stop that move, or just wait for us to play h6 and then play g6, so they don't open and they keep the position as blocked as possible. If they play h6 trying to stop our h6, then there would be many tactic ideas with bishop or knight sacrifices on that square. So in the end, when our opponent plays this move, we got what we wanted. We created a weakness on h6, and then we can try to take advantage of that. And when they don't play a6, so we just played a6 and they block by playing e6, there will be weaknesses in dark squares. So a very common plan will be to try to get rid of this bishop, because it's going to be the defender of those squares. So there is this plan of putting the bishop on g5 and trying to trade those bishops. Once this bishop is not on the board, we will be able to exploit the weakness, for example on f6 and hopefully on g7, especially with the knight going, for example, to g4, f6 is a very typical plan once they play g6. I think we need to talk about what can happen or how to play if we cannot get the typical attack position where we block the center and then we focus on the king side. Well, I'm gonna show you 3 different positions black can try and how to play in those 3 positions. So let's assume a Sicilian defense with c5 and then knight f3, e6. Then we can play d3, knight c6, and after g3 they can play here a fianchetto with g6, putting some pressure here on e5. And well, let's assume bishop g2, bishop g7, castling, knight e7, and c3 just to stop that bishop. Is a normal move. Sometimes we can also play d4. Black castles, we want to play rook e1, and then they can play here e5 just to make sure we're not playing e5 anytime soon. So how to play in those positions where our opponent stopped our plan? Here we can play a3, and they have 2 ways to play. They can play with d6 or with d5. So if they play with d6, they have this structure here. A common and good way to play against this is by breaking on the queen side. So the idea is that we're gonna focus on that side of the board this time, and we want to play this move before. If they trade, this is going to be good for us because they lose a central pawn for a pawn from the edge, and also we open this a file for our rook. So usually they need to play something like b6. Well, this position is very normal, it's more or less equal. We can continue with a normal development like knight d2, let's see, any move like h6, and then bishop b2. The middle game is more or less even. At some point we can try to break over d4, sometimes c4, also d5. If we can maneuver over there with the knight, maybe we can get something with that. But the main idea is that even when it is more or less even, it's very comfortable to play as white in these positions. The other idea is when they, instead of playing with d6, they play d5, so we can have an structure like this one on the board, where they have the 2 pawns controlling very well d4. These positions are actually very well and very playable. We can bring the knight over d2, and the idea is that there are 2 interesting squares on c4 and e4. So we have 2 knights and 2 interesting squares, so you can imagine what we are gonna do is to maneuver to get those squares and put pressure on black's central pawns. Also, we need to highlight this bishop on the great diagonal and the typical breaks over b4, At some point, of course, the queen usually goes to c3. Don't lose that pawn there, because then you're going to be in disadvantage. This mid game is, of course, much more positional, but I can tell you that the position is very playable and very interesting. And finally, another thing black can try when they want to avoid the typical blocked position where we attack on the king side is to trade in the center at some point. I'm going to show you a main line, for example, like knight d2, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and after g3, knight f6, bishop g2. This is the same order we have been analyzing. Then we castle, black castles, and after rook e1, let's assume black doesn't want to let us play e5. They can trade here on e4. Well, when this happens, well, the game is going to be more or less equal, but we can get something interesting in the middle game. So for example, we can capture d takes e4. Usually they will need to play e5 to get some space over there, but also to clear the bishop. But when they play this, they are going to create weaknesses over d5 and f5. This means that we can maneuver a little, especially with the knight over c4, e3, trying to get those squares. Sometimes over f1, e3 is also an option. The main idea is that we will try to get advantage, especially of this square, as they cannot do the same, at least not so easily, because we have the c pawn here, so we could be playing c3 at some point and control that square. So let me show you what can happen. We can play knight c4. Queen c7 is a normal move, protecting the center, but also clearing d8, and then we can continue with our plan, like knight e3, and now rook d8 doesn't create any real problem. They're attacking the queen, but we are fine after knight d5, and now we are attacking black queen. One more time, these positions are more or less equal, but again, it's very easy and probably a little more comfortable to play as white. There is this Masters game, is probably the most famous example about this line. It was played by Fischer versus Masuren. In this game, black played a French defense and Fischer continued with d3, wanting to play a King's Indian attack. After d5, he played knight d2. After knight f6, he continued g3 and then c5. This is a position we have already analyzed in our main line. Bishop g2, knight c6, knight from g to f3, and then bishop e7. Fischer castled and black did the same. And at this point he blocked the center, so he's preparing everything to start the attack on the king side. After knight d7, we can play rook e1 here, and after b5 we can start advancing with the knight to the king side. b4 was played, h4 is normal, a5, and bishop f4 is also very well. a4, and at this point Fischer is going to play a really interesting move. In these positions, of course, we're going to attack on the king side very strongly, but as you can imagine, black is not going to stay there just watching as we attack. They will try to react very strongly on the queen side, and black's attack is actually dangerous. We need to take a look at the queen side from time to time and make good decisions. At this point, Fischer found a move that was revolutionary at its moment. Black is threatening a3, forcing b3, and then they are creating a weakness here on c3, so they could be taking advantage of that weakness later by maneuvering with the knight to c3, or also putting the knight on d4, and after the trade the weakness on c3 and c2 is very clear. So this idea of a3 was very annoying, but in this game Fischer found this move that is going to make a stop to black's attack, and it is this a3. This is going to delay black's ideas on the queen side, so we have some more time to succeed on the king side. B takes a3 was played, b takes a3, and then knight goes to a5. Then knight e3, and then we start maneuvering with the knight, bishop a6, and bishop a3. In some positions the bishop can be interesting here with a minor piece sacrifice on e6. The game continues d4, and then Fischer went back to f1. Also knight g4 is very playable, but Fischer was planning knight d2, knight e4, so he was trying to get this square. Knight b6 and knight g5, very normal in these positions. Knight d5 and then bishop d2. Of course we don't want to trade our bishop for the knight, so bishop d2, keeping the bishop on a very good position. Bishop takes g5 was played, bishop takes g5, and then queen d7, and now we involve the queen on the attack. So queen h5, rook f, c8, and knight d2 going, as we were saying, to e4, and from e4 we could be going to f6 in some positions, or d6. Knight c3, and at this point is when everything is going to start. Here Fischer played a very aggressive but interesting move. I would say try now. If you want, you can try to find this typical King's Indian attack move. The move Fischer played in this moment was bishop f6, and of course this is a bishop sacrifice, but it's not so easy for black to take that bishop. Actually, in the game black just played here queen e8, but well, let's see what can happen. If black takes that bishop, we can play pawn takes pawn, and now we are threatening check, check, and if the king goes here, well, queen g8 checkmate. So the threat is very clear and very strong. They can still try king h8, but also another typical idea we need to understand from these King's Indian attack positions is the weakness on h7. Very often in these positions black won't have a good way to defend h7, so there is a move trying to take advantage of that, and it's going to be really strong. So the move white could have played here was this fantastic, really interesting and beautiful bishop f5. We want to give checkmate here, and if black takes that bishop, well, we can get now the 7th rank now that we deflected that pawn. Here we're attacking the queen, but also we're taking f7, and it's not only one pawn, it's also checkmate here on h7. Let's say queen d8, well, we can capture with the rook, and even when black can play queen g8, this is still fine, because we can play rook g7. Black needs to sacrifice the queen here, and well, this position looks like black has a rook and 2 minor pieces for a queen, so anyone could say black is more or less fine, but when we analyze how weak this king is, how discovered it is, and how easy it is for white pieces to get involved in some attack, for example with the knight over here or with the rook over here, we can see that this is actually one for white. The game could continue like rook e1, threatening rook e7, getting the 7th rank, and after rook c7, knight f3. The attack is going to be very strong, and this position is decisive advantage for white. So that's why black doesn't accept the bishop. They just defend against the threat queen g5, and they found this move queen e8. At this point, knight e4 was played, and g6. Queen g5, queen h6 doesn't make sense by now because black can play queen f8. However, this move is going to be a threat all the time. So black needs to keep in mind this move in every position, and they cannot move the queen because this could be winning for white. Knight takes e4, rook takes e4, and then c4, trying to react on the other side. But well, Fischer didn't worry that much about this move. He continued with his plan because he saw that his attack should be decisive. So he played here h5, the spearhead of our attack is going to continue advancing. The idea is that now we are clearing this square so the rook can go to the h file, and after c takes d3, he didn't care that much about this. He just played rook h4, and well, black needed to defend here with rook a7 because there is a hidden threat here. For example, if black continues capturing things over there like d takes c2, well, there is this move h takes, and well, black needs to recapture with f, and then we have rook h7. So this point is not protected by the rook now, so rook takes pawn is just winning. After king takes, we will have checkmate like queen h4, queen h8, and queen g7. So checkmate in 3 moves. So that's why at this point, after rook h4, black needed to play rook a7, so they are defending. If there is a trade, now they are defending over the 7th rank h7. However, white is still winning. Fischer found another very typical and important move for King's Indian attack positions. I will say it, but I think it's going to be very well if you try to find it. It's a typical reinforcement move. It's a move we do very often in King's Indian attack when we want to add some piece to the attack. So try to find it, but I will say it right now. Bobby found at this point the idea of bringing the bishop to this diagonal. As we were saying, this could be decisive in many positions. So he found the best move of the position, and it is bishop g2, wanting to play bishop e4. This move is decisive, is already winning for white. In the game, black took the pawn and continued with his ideas, but let me share with you this line. For example, if black plays bishop b7, trying to stop bishop e4, well, white is still winning. The problem is that now the rook is not really defending, so we can do the same idea. We had some moves earlier, like h takes g6, f takes g6, and then rook a7, and after king h7 we have mate in 3 with check, check, and mate. So bishop b7 is not really defending in that position. In the game, d takes c2 was played, but well, now this is actually winning for white. It is a good moment to bring the queen to a6. We are certainly mate here on g7. Black plays queen f8, trying to stop that. But well, it is white to move here. White is winning. There is checkmate in 3 moves. I will say it right now. Fischer played here a queen sacrifice on h7, and the idea is that he wants to bring the king and also open the file. So queen takes h7 and black resigned. After king takes a7, we can play h takes g6. This is double check with pawn and rook. Black has to move either king g8 or king g6. After king g8, we can play rook h8. That's checkmate. And after king g6, well, remember the bishop that we brought it from h3 to g2. Well, the bishop is going to give the final touch in this position with bishop e4. I want to show you typical tactic ideas that can happen when we are playing King's Indian attack. This is going to be very important because it's going to let us identify tactics in our own games, but also it's going to help us to create the tactic ideas and tricks and threats. So before we start calculating in these 5 puzzles, I want to talk about 3 typical essential ideas we're going to see in some of them. And first of all, one of them is the bishop on the 4 and the queen on c7. Usually this queen is coming over there to put pressure on e5, but also to put pressure over the file. So that's usually the best square for black queen. This bishop will be on f4 very intentionally because it's going to be on the same line as the queen, and then we can create some ideas. The first one is this sacrifice on d5, and there is that we want to deflect this pawn so we can discover with the other pawn. Secondly, I want to mention sacrifice on f6, and it's more or less the same idea. Once there is a capture, the pawn is recapturing, and then we are opening, and this pawn on f6 is going to create more threats and more problems over there, and also very often we are getting a piece back over there. And finally, I want to mention the typical sacrifices on h6. That's something we might have mentioned sometime before, and they will happen in some of these 5 puzzles. So this is the first position. It is white to move and white is winning. I will say it very soon, but feel free to pause the video. It's going to be a good training for a King's Indian attack player. The way to win here is by playing, as you can imagine, bishop takes d5. We were using this position as an example already, and after e takes d5 we can play e6. And here we are getting the piece back. Let's say black plays queen d8, we can capture that piece, and of course they can get the pawn back very soon, maybe after some rook e6 to make sure they're not losing the bishop on e7. They can take it, but the main idea is that in this position we opened the e file, which we are controlling. We also opened our bishop, and we created weak, doubled, and isolated pawns on the d file. So we should say that this position is clearly better for white. So this is position number 2. White plays, white wins. I will say it right now. So one more time, the queen on the same line as the bishop, so we can play a sacrifice on f6 to create some problems over there. So the first move is going to be knight f6 check, and well, in the game they accepted the knight, but also I want to mention what can happen if king h8. Well, we can continue with a very strong attack by playing knight g5. Now we are threatening knight f7, that's checkmate, and even if black defends with knight d8, well, queen h5, and then more threats over here and more threats over f7. So black can play f6 here, and well, the best move according to the engine is c4, and it's decisive advantage for white. But I like to mention this idea where we play queen takes f7 and they cannot take the queen because we have checkmate with knight takes knight. That's interesting. So the game continued pawn takes knight and pawn takes pawn, and now we are threatening bishop but also threatening queen. So we are getting the piece back, and the king is going to be very open. They can still try bishop d6, but this is not really going to be a very good idea because the attack is going to be very strong. For example, we can continue knight g5, and after bishop f4 we don't even have to take there. We can play queen h5 at this point, and there is a big weakness here on g7. So that's the main target we're trying to get here with this maneuver of queen h5. So well, after queen h5 they can't take the knight, but well, this is fine. And after knight g6 we can play queen h6, and I don't think there is a way to stop queen g7 here. That's what happens if black tries bishop d6, that the weakness on g7 is going to be a huge problem. So instead of that, they just played here queen d8, and then we capture that bishop. And after queen e7, well, this position is already good for white. Observe, the king is discovered, so all these trades were a good sequence, a good combination for white. We should have decisive advantage here. I'm just going to highlight the change of the position. It was like this, and after this sequence of 3 moves, we have this position on the board. I'm going to highlight 3 things: 2 bishops, half open file and a lot of pressure over there, and king safety. So white is better because of those 3 factors. Position number 3, white to move, white is winning. I will say it right now. As we said, sometimes we can force our opponent to play a6, maybe to stop this plan, or maybe to control g5, and this is going to be a weakness if we can actually make them play it. So the way to continue in this position is going to be by sacrificing the bishop on that square, and once we do that, the king is going to be very discovered. The sacrifice is a bishop for 2 pawns. That's not like a huge material disadvantage, so we can live without that point, and the attack is going to be very strong once those pawns are not there. So bishop takes h6 was played, and after pawn takes bishop, he did not rush to capture on h6. He played queen d2, he increased the pressure, and he involved the queen in the attack. And after knight h7, again he can capture, but he just played queen f4 first. And after knight d8, another King's Indian attack move was played, and it is bishop f1, bringing the bishop to this interesting diagonal. King h8, bishop d3, and after rook g8, then queen takes h6. Rook g6 was played. Observe that rook g7 is not getting too much. We can just play knight f6, a lot of pressure here, and after bishop f8, knight g5, the pressure is just too much. So instead of that, he just played rook g6 and bishop takes rook, pawn takes bishop, knight f6, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. The threat is now on g7, so black plays queen c7, but now the knight is going to create some problems. So knight e5, and after king g8, we are going to deflect the queen by playing rook a c1. Observe, all the squares on the 7th rank are very well controlled by white pieces, so the position is lost here. They need to move the queen, and then they can receive checkmate. Even if they try something like, I don't know, bishop c6 here, well, we have many ways to win, but this is very simple for us, very clear. Rook takes c6, and the knight is the defender here of this square. So once the knight goes to c6, we can play f7, and this is just winning. Puzzle number 4, white to move, white is winning. I will say it right now. In this position, there is another typical King's Indian move, and it is this bishop f6. Observe, the king side is not protected by minor pieces, only the pawns, so that's why we are trying to create some chaos over there. Bishop f6, and black took the pawn on d4, but we should take a look at what can happen after pawn takes bishop. Well, then we can play knight g4, we are getting the queen, but well, it's not only about the queen, it's also about h7 with mate, so this position is very complicated. After knight d7, well, there's a fantastic move for white. Observe the queen on the same line as the rook, but some pieces in the middle. But you know what? We can try to stop that. We can get rid of those pieces. So bishop takes d5 is very strong. And if the pawn takes, we can capture the other pawn on f6. And well, now we are taking the queen, and also we are setting checkmate over here. After king h8, we can capture, and after rook takes, well, we can play here queen d5. This position, as you can imagine, is decisive advantage for white. But after bishop takes d5, even if black doesn't take, and they try something like rook c8, so they don't want to open anything, so the queen is safe there, well, we can just play knight takes f6, and after knight takes, pawn takes, we are threatening checkmate over here, over g7, so they need to play king h8, and the main difference is that now our bishop can go to e4, because the pawn is not on d5, so we can go there one more time, get advantage of that weakness. Bishop e4, this is winning, there's nothing black can do here to stop checkmate. So that's why black did not accept the bishop, and they just continued getting some material over the center. But well, the problem is that now the bishop is too annoying, it's too powerful there on f6, so the attack is going to be really strong. So knight g4 was played, and after knight f5, queen g5, and well, there are many threats, but for example, knight h6 is one of them. Also bishop takes pawn. In the game, king h8, but then, well, bishop takes pawn and knight f6, and one more time, the main idea is the weakness on h7. So queen d8, queen h6, and black can sacrifice the queen, but well, of course queen takes queen, and this is decisive advantage for white. And this is my favorite tactic position from this list. As you know, the best for the end. White to move, white is winning, try to find it, I will explain it right now. So black already has big problems and big weaknesses here on dark squares, f6 and g7, so we are gonna try to take advantage of that. The first move in this position is spectacular, trying to deflect the queen so it doesn't protect f6 anymore. So we're gonna play here the amazing rook a8, and well, in the game black just played here queen e7. They tried to avoid that capture, but let me tell you what can happen if queen takes rook. White can play knight f6 check. If the knight takes, well, queen takes, and that will be mate. It's unstoppable. But even if they move the king, well, knight takes knight should be winning because the weakness is still there, and there are too many problems, and the knights are still very active. So that's why after rook a8, black just played queen e7. But well, knight f6 was played either way. After knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, the queen goes to b4, trying to keep the rook protected so they can recapture there. But well, then there is a very nice move to finish the game, forcing black's resignation, and it is this queen c7. The idea is that now there is a very important threat here on f7. Black doesn't have too many options to deal with that threat. For example, if black plays here knight b8, well, here there is this idea of sacrificing here on f7 or maybe on e6, but we shouldn't rush because black has a threat. So we can play, for example, king e2 first, avoiding queen e1 check, but also taking advantage of the queen tied, protecting that knight, so now the queen cannot move too much, and then we can continue with this or this idea. For example, if we capture directly, black can play queen e1 check, and we shouldn't go here because bishop f1 is very dangerous, probably winning for black. So we should go to h2, and then they can try check, and well, I don't think we get anything here. This is going to be a draw. If we block with the bishop, black is playing bishop f1 and black is winning, and if we go down, they can continue with perpetual check, queen e1 and queen f2. That's why we need to play this sort of move king e2 first, but it's enough to win the game. In the next move, we are playing either knight f7, deflecting the rook so we can capture b8, or bishop takes e6, and if the pawn takes, we will have checkmate here or here. If you guys have any question, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much, guys. Like, subscribe. See you on the next.